الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الكريم وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن استنى بسنة إلى يوم الدين. All praise is due to Allah, and may Allah's peace and blessings be on the last Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and on all those who follow the path of righteousness until the last day. Basically, we have finished our section on Usul al-Aqidah. This is an introduction really to the Usul of Aqidah, and we are now going on into Usul al-Tafsir. The first of the topics from Usul al-Tafsir, and Usul means basically foundations, coming from the Arabic term Asl, which means an origin, the base, the root. It's called the Asl. So Usul is the plural from it, meaning foundations, foundational principles. Tafsir comes from the Arabic verb fassara, yufassiru tafsiran, which means to explain or to clarify. So when we're talking about Usul al-Tafsir, we're talking about the fundamental principles necessary for Quranic interpretation, the tools which enable us to interpret the Quran correctly, accurately, within human limits or limitations. Now, for us to look at the Quran itself, we may look at it from an external perspective, the structure and these kind of things, or we may look at it from an internal perspective, its contents and these types of things. We'll start from the external and look at how the Quran was compiled and collected. Is it something, basic knowledge, which every Muslim should know? We don't have a problem in dealing with the history of the Quran's collection, because it only confirms for us in the end its authenticity. Whereas religions like Christianity, Buddhism and all these others, when you go into the history of the compilation of their scriptures, what that does is it creates doubts in the minds of the followers as to its authenticity. And this is why they don't like to go there. They keep that hidden from the followers. They weave a bunch of other stories, to give the text a sense of emotional authority. Right? This is what they work from. Inspired scribes, And this is what they like to focus on, This is the emotional. But now when you get down to the nitty-gritty, the academic realities, the historical facts concerning compilation, then you know that what's in the hands of the Buddhists today is unreliable. What's in the hands of the Christians today is unreliable. What's in the hands of the Jews today is unreliable. Historical criticism by their own scholars confirm that the material that they have is of questionable authenticity. Either they tell you that the Gospels were written by unknown authors, and they will tell you that. Those who are honest, you'll find it in their writings, in the encyclopedias and all this kind of stuff. It's there. Or they will tell you that, the material in it is of questionable historical authenticity, because much of the text wasn't confirmed in their earliest manuscripts. So when you go to the what is known as the Codex Vaticanus, and you compare it to later manuscripts, in the 6th century, 10th century, you find all kinds of material that wasn't in the Codex Vaticanus or the Codex Sinaiticus. These are their earliest two compilations of the New Testament. And in those codices, you find material which isn't available in the current text that we have. And between these two codices, you find material in one which is not in the other. So that their scholars will tell you that the documents of the Gospels alone exceed 5,000. No two documents agreeing on all facts. You have a problem. Historical analysis proves the lack of authenticity. This is why they skirt around the issue. They don't deal with it. It doesn't increase them in iman. It increases them in doubt. Whereas our look at the origin of the compilation of the Quran, this increases us in iman. This is why we learn it. This is why it should be taught. Our children should know it. Know who the figures are, what happened, what took place, why. No problem with it at all. So we know Prophet Muhammad ﷺ's prophethood spanned 23 years. He received revelation at the age of 40, approximately 610 of the Christian era, and that continued until 632 at the time of his death. And we know that the Quran was revealed to him in segments, in pieces. It didn't come to him as a complete text. Furthermore, we know that initially, when that text was revealed to him, he attempted to memorize it by repeating whatever he heard from Angel Gabriel, Angel Jibril. Then Allah instructed him, saying, لا تحرك به لسانك لتعجل به إن علينا جمعه وقرآنه فإذا قرأناه فاتبع قرآنه. Do not move your tongue hastily to learn it. Indeed, I will collect it and recite it. So when I recite it, follow its recital. Allah told the Prophet ﷺ, don't try to memorize it by repeating after Angel Gabriel. I will protect it with you. And when the Prophet ﷺ stopped doing that, whatever came to him was burnt into his memory. Whatever Allah chose for him to forget was forgotten from his memory. Now, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is known to have been what they called ummi. This has been translated as illiterate, though when we use the term illiterate, we're talking about somebody who is ignorant. Not only does he not know how to read and write, but he likely doesn't have any kind of higher knowledge of the language and expression and means of communication, all these kind of things. Whereas when we talk about Prophet Muhammad ﷺ being ummi, we're only talking about him being unable to read and write. That's all. But in terms of his mastery of the language, his ability to express himself, and to understand what was said, then it was at its peak. He was trained from the childhood. He was sent by his mother to be with Halima as-Sa'diyah, a Bedouin woman sent outside of Mecca for him to develop his linguistic skills. This was the tradition. So he grew with that same tradition. And the Arabian culture in that era was basically an oral culture. Most of the people did not know how to read and write. So they depended on their memories. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ fell into that general category. Now, as he learned the Quran himself, he used to teach it to his companions by reciting portions of the Quran in prayer. This was a means of teaching them. Now, you and I may question, how in the world that's somebody going to teach somebody? Somebody recites Surah Al-Baqarah for you. The first time you ever heard it, it went in one ear, went out the other. Right? So how is that a mode of teaching? Well, you have to consider that in those times, because the people were an oral culture, and they used to have contests in Ta'if and other locations, Uqad, where people used to gather from all around Arabia, and they would, as poets, as people of oratory, would stand up and say long odes and poems and elaborate, beautiful statements as a means of showing their own personal greatness as well as the greatness of their tribes. They used to meet for these contests, and they so much loved poetry that the 7 most popular poems were etched in gold and hung on the Kaaba, became objects of worship. No problem. They idolized, adored beautiful poetry. And they were known. People would come from some part of Arabia, they would run off an ode of 100 lines. And after they finished doing it, others who heard it for the first time would stand up and repeat the same thing, line for line, word for word. I mean, this is something unimaginable in our times. Right? Why? Because we are from a written culture. And this is why it's important for you to understand that the experiment which is commonly done in schools, I'm sure you've all experienced this, where the teacher, your English teacher or whoever, will write a little paragraph of material and have the first person in your class on the right hand side, for example, or left hand side, read it, little paragraph, 5-6 sentences. Then he or she will tell the person behind what they heard. Then that person tells the next one, tells the next one, tells the next one, working all the way down the classroom to the last person. And the last person stands up and says what he or she heard, and then they read what the original thing was. Everybody has a big laugh. You never wondered what was the purpose of that? The purpose of that experiment is to deride oral culture. That is the single purpose of it. You cannot rely on orally transmitted information. So those societies that are known to be oral societies, where their history has been handed down orally over generations, you cannot rely on this stuff. It's probably a bunch of nonsense, hogwash. But the reality is not the case. This is not the reality. Yes, you do this in a written culture and you have that result. But in an oral culture, where from the time you are able to communicate, you are required to memorize material constantly, you have a whole different situation. When mom sends you to the store, down to the trader who is selling their whatever goods they're selling, and she tells you, you need to get me a this and a that and the other, and and you go and you come back and you didn't get what she told you, you got a spanking. Next time, you listen attentively and you make sure you bring back what she asked you to get. And you are raised with that tradition. Now you have memory at a stage which we cannot imagine. So now you do that same experiment in a class of people from an oral culture, and that first story which is said to the other person will end up in the end. Maybe if one word or here is slightly changed, but the meaning exactly the same. They don't lose it because their minds have been trained. As the people of a written culture, their minds have not been changed. And this is why, for example, you'll see professors who come out of Egypt, places like this, where it is standard for you to memorize the Quran, to memorize the 1,000 lines of poetry of Alfiya, which Ibn Malik, which teaches you all the grammar rules in 1,000 lines of poetry, and you memorize, the Alfiya of Al-Iraqi, all of the rules of hadith science are all put in 1,000 lines of poetry. You have 1,000 for this and 1,000 for that. They're growing up memorizing this stuff. They go into school, of course they're studying in other areas, maybe they go into science or whatever. They come over to America, they get their PhDs, whatever, and you see the difference between the American professor. When he comes, he's going to teach, he's got all his notes there, he's flipping through his notes, and the Egyptian professor, he comes and he's just giving you the lecture. No books, no papers. It's all in his head. It's amazing. You say, wow, this guy really knows his stuff. That's the difference, because he has been trained in that tradition. This is the difference. I know it myself personally. I used to, when I studied in Medina, most of my professors were Egyptians. A professor which we had for tafsir, this man was an encyclopedia, a walking encyclopedia. He didn't bring a single piece of paper to class. And he would run down from the Quran, he would take this verse and he'd break it down and give all the explanations of Tabari and Ibn Kathir and everybody else. And we would have the books there, look at it, wow, man, this guy is just right on it, And if we ask him something in grammar, he would quote the lines from Alfiya and break it down for us, no matter what subject you came to him with, This is a whole another level of memory, right? So that experiment, which was done to ridicule oral culture, is false. It is used out of context, and it doesn't prove anything beyond the fact that in a written culture you can't rely on orally transmitted information. That's all it proves. That's all it proves, right? Anyway, so Prophet Muhammad ﷺ reciting Baqarah in Salah among his companions, they heard him recite it once or twice, and they had it. And they were reciting Baqarah in their Salah. So reciting Quran in Salah was a means of teaching his companions Quran. And this is why in Islam, when we are choosing the Imam, right? Tradition says if we got to make the Imam, we choose the Sheikh, the one with the biggest beard, the oldest. He's the one we choose to lead us in prayer. But that's not what Islam says. That's what tradition might say. Islam says it's the one who knows the most Quran. As one of the companions said, after he had stayed with the Prophet ﷺ and studied, he had memorized all of Baqarah. He came back to his tribe, and he in a group, they informed the tribe that the Prophet ﷺ said, the one who leads you in prayer should be the one who knows the most Quran. And he said, when they looked around, it turned out that I knew the most Quran. And I was only around 6 years old at the time. So I led the tribe from that point onward. That is the Sunnah. Today, if we gather together and somebody says, hey, we got a little kid here, 6 years old, let him lead the prayer. What? We got the Shaykh here, No. The one who knows, memorized the most Quran is the one who leads the Salah. And that is the correct priority. Why? Why do we give priority of him over the sheikh, the older person, etc.? Why? Because it is better that we have that kid, because the sheikh, of course, he is more pious, he's practicing the deen, and all of this other things of purity and piety is all there. The little kid, he's a naughty little kid anyway, normally, right? You get him out of the prayer, he's naughty. But he knows his Quran. We still favor him over the sheikh. Why? Because it is better to have him recite the Quran for us, so we are exposed to as much of the Quran as possible, than to have the sheikh, he's an old man, whatever, all he knows is Qul Huwallahu Ahad. So every salah is Qul Huwallahu Ahad, He may be pious, but it is not improving our exposure to the Quran, because the idea is we want to hear as much of Allah's word as possible. So we put the kid up front, even though he's naughty, he knows the most Quran, let him lead the salah. This is the correct, and this is the principle behind it, right? So Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in his prayers, he used to recite, chunks from the different parts of the Quran, and the Sahaba used to memorize it. Also, everyone who accepted Islam was taught portions of the Quran which was necessary for them to establish their salah. You needed to know something of the Quran to make salah. Of course, I should mention here that if a person doesn't know any of the Quran, what do you do? What do you do? If they haven't learned Surah Al-Fatiha, what do you do? Tasbih. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, one occasion, one of the Bedouins came to him and told him, hey, I can't memorize this thing. Surah Al-Fatiha. I couldn't memorize Surah Al-Fatiha. So the Prophet ﷺ told him to say in his prayer, Subhanallah, walhamdulillah, wa la ilaha illallah, wallahu akbar. This is what we are supposed to teach people when they first come in. Subhanallah. This is something everybody knows. We say. When something happens which is amazing, we say Subhanallah. You teach. These are amongst the phrases of the Muslim. Walhamdulillah. Everybody says Alhamdulillah. We say it, thanking Allah for them. Wa la ilaha illallah. We have to say that to become Muslim. Allahu Akbar. The prayers. So the person who doesn't know Al-Fatiha, what he does or she does is they recite that until they learn the Fatiha, and they recite in the rest of their prayer that until they replace the different parts by the correct phrases and du'as, etc. to say. This is the correct methodology. Not to do as I did. Nobody told me any better. When I first came into the deen, I wrote out Fatiha on a piece of paper, put it down on the mat in front of me, big letters, so I would read it from the mat. No, this is not correct. I did it. Other people did it. But this is not the correct method. Anyway, the second method, as I said, of learning Quran was the Prophet ﷺ and his companions teaching those who accepted Islam portions from the Quran. The third method was that he encouraged his companions to teach the Quran to others. He told them in a well-known statement of his, خَيْرُكُمْ مَنْ تَعَلَّمَ الْقُرْآنَ وَعَلَّمَهُ. The best of you are those who learn the Quran and teach it to others. Not just the best of you are those who learn the Quran, but those who learn the Quran and teach it to others. So of course the companions wanted to be the best, and so they would try to learn as much as they could, and they taught it to others. Those who were able to read and write, the Prophet ﷺ gathered around himself certain scribes among his companions. He gathered them, those who could read and write, and he dictated to them what was being revealed to him, and they wrote. Of course, in those days there was no paper in Arabia. In China, yes, it had been discovered in China, but it didn't reach Arabia. The Egyptians were using papyrus. They made a kind of paper out of papyrus, but no papyrus grew in Arabia. They didn't have any paper. So they wrote on whatever materials they could find. They wrote on stones. But when they say they wrote on stones, we should have a clear picture of that in our mind. Don't think that they got a rock which is looking like a ball and they were writing all over the ball, right? Please, when they say they wrote on stones, it means they had flat stones, sections of what we call like slate. You have some rocks which are formed in layers. When you break it off, you can break off like slabs, right, which are relatively flat because of the mode in which it's formed, and you can write on that, right, etching onto it. Or they wrote on the boughs of palm trees, right? Some people call it palm leaves. They weren't writing on the leaves. The bough, where the branch meets the trunk, that section there is wide. If you break it off and you etch in it, just as a tree, trees that are young, if you make any kind of markings in it, like with a nail or a knife, whatever, that remains virtually the life of the tree. It oxidizes and remains fixed. So they would write on the boughs of the palm tree. Also, they wrote on bones. People say wrote on bones. Hey, again, don't think that they got a femur, a leg bone or an arm bone, and they're trying to write on these. No. They wrote on shoulder blades, right? This, if you see in the structure of the human body, they weren't using human shoulder blades, but you'll see that this is sort of a large flat bone, the largest flat bone in the body. They would take the shoulder blades of camels, which were quite large, became like a slate that you could write on also. And those who could afford it, they also wrote on the skins of goats and sheep. They refer to this as vellum, and this is was the most popular means of recording written material from the early centuries, like the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's what they're written on. Skin, sheep skin, goat skin. This is what they're written on, not paper. Okay? So they wrote down on these various materials which were available, and when the Prophet ﷺ died, by the time he died, the Quran was not written down in a single text. It was not in a single text, and only a handful of his companions, some say 8, some 7, some say different numbers, had memorized the whole Quran in its entirety. Many of them had memorized large amounts. Actually, in the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, those, as the companions said, who had memorized Baqarah were called Hafiz. And today, Hafiz means you have memorized the whole Quran. In those days, you memorized Surah Al-Baqarah, you're called Hafiz. So, most of the companions had memorized large chunks when the Prophet ﷺ died. Now, within a year after his death, a situation developed in Arabia. Abu Bakr, who was chosen to be the Khalifa after the death of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he sent off an army which had been instructed by Rasulullah ﷺ, led by Usama ibn Zayd, who was the son of his former adopted son Zayd ibn al-Haritha. This grand adopted son, former, was around 16 or 17 years at the time. Now, after the Prophet ﷺ died, Abu Bakr got them together to send them off. Some of the companions objected. They said, he's too young. Let's put somebody older, one of the senior companions. Abu Bakr insisted, no. Rasulullah ﷺ said, he is to lead the army, he's going to lead the army. So, he went out. Behind him were senior companions that had been with the Prophet ﷺ from the early days and all. They're all under his command, 16 or 17 years old at the time. It's an important point in that when some people who seek to distort the image of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ by accusing him of pedophilia, important point, because of the marriage to Aisha, right? Remember, he married Aisha when she was 7 years old. She came to live with him when she was 9 years old. So they said, hey, some Christian missionaries, whatever, to just give that sledgehammer blow in the head of Muslims. Hey, your prophet was a pedophile. It's a big thing today. They're rounding up pedophiles all over. So Muslims, usually when this comes at them, they feel very shy, very small, and want to just hide it. Hey, what to say. Some scholars, in response to this, Muslim, of some knowledge, whatever, tried to write books, and there's a book published which is saying that Aisha wasn't 7 years old at the time. She was really 16, 17. But no. The evidence in Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim clearly indicate she was 7 years old, 6 or 7 years old when she was first married and came to live with the Prophet ﷺ when she was 9. How do you deal with this reality? Right? Important. You deal with it by putting it in its context. You see, when you take something out of context, it may appear, hey, this is something not good. Muslims feel shy about it. No, put it in its context. Go around the world. Everybody was marrying what we now call kids. It's all over the world. How many rulers all over the place were doing this? Secondly, what we're talking about here is marriage. What do pedophiles do? They go marry little kids? They're not marrying. They're going into areas where people are poor or whatever, exploiting them with money, and they use them and they abuse them. This is pedophiles. This is pedophilia. They're not marrying anybody. So we're talking about marriage. We're talking about a time when the average age of a person's life was 35 to 40 years old. Prophet ﷺ made it to 62. He was a grand old man. In that society, by the time you reached 6, 7, the girls, they knew how to take care of a home. They were learned in these things. Not to say they were still not kids and they had kid things, but they knew how to take care of a home. They learned. This is why you had Usama ibn Zayd leading the Muslim army at the age of 16. Can you imagine, during the Gulf War, instead of Schwarzkopf or Colin Powell, they brought some 16-year-old kid from high school, put him in charge of the... Man, he'd be pressing buttons and sending, nuclear rockets, he'd be blowing the world up, right? You couldn't trust any 16-year-old kid to... Because it's a whole different situation, I mean, when you compare young girls today, they may reach their 20s, they'll be 25, you still can't take care of a home. They've been pampered, mom's always doing everything, so the kid grows up, she gets married and she has to come back home and say, Mom, how do you do this? She has to come back and learn things that she should have learned growing up, because it's a whole different approach to rearing children. So you have to put it in its context. And then again, we say to them, hey, how do you decide at what age a person may be married? They say, well, if you're in England, it's 18. In England, it's 18. Actually, they're not even talking about marriage. They're talking about consensual sex. Right? If you're 18. If you're in France, it's 17. If you're in Germany, it's 16. If you're in Italy, it's 14. If you're in Holland, it's 12. Hey, what's going on here? So what is considered pedophilia in England is considered legal consensual sex in Holland. They don't have a basis. Where do these numbers come from? What Islam has is that when that girl reaches puberty, what is puberty? Puberty is nature, of Allah's way, through what we call nature, showing us that this young girl has now become a young woman. She is capable of bearing a child. That is the natural line. And that's what Islam says. Whereas for you guys, it's just numbers. No rational basis for these numbers. So, I just mentioned that as a side point from a Dawah perspective to understand significance of Usama ibn Zayd being chosen as the Amir of the army. Anyway, so he took the major army and headed off to the north to deal with the Romans who were coming down threatening Islam in Arabia. Now, after this had taken place, tribes in Arabia who had converted to Islam and had agreed to pay zakah, they decided when the Prophet ﷺ died, hey, we don't want to pay zakah anymore. For them, they understood zakah to be tribute, as the conquering Romans or the Persians in the past, when they would conquer an area of Arabia, the tribes there had to pay tribute. Everybody had to come up with some money, to pay the conquerors. This is called tribute. So when they converted to Islam and they agreed to pay zakah, they considered it like tribute. So now the ruler, Muhammad ﷺ, died. We're not obliged anymore. Right? So they came, they said, hey, listen, we want to be excused from zakah. We want to be excused from zakah. So Omar said, hey, listen, Abu Bakr, let's excuse them. Or if they're Muslims, maybe they're not making the zakah, but they're doing everything else. Right? Abu Bakr said, I will not make any distinction between salah and zakah. If they paid a hobbling cord's worth of zakah in the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, they're going to pay it now. What is a hobbling cord? A hobbling cord is a loop of rope, circle, which the Arabs, the Bedouins, when you're traveling on the desert, you carried with you. If you stopped, because not many trees on the desert, if you stopped, then what they would do is they would bend the leg of the camel back, one leg, and they would wrap this circle of cord around the knee of the camel. They call this a hobbling cord. It hobbled the camel, meaning that the camel now could not run away. Because that was, of course, critical. If you got off your camel and you didn't tie the camel, he is gone. That's the camel. They'll just fly out of there. And you're left in the middle of the desert. That's it. You're dead. So critical to carry your hobbling cord. Now, what they did, that hoop, they twisted it into a figure 8. They put the two circles together, and they used to carry it where? On the head. You see the Arabs wearing that gutra, that scarf-like thing with the two loops of black. That's what it is. I mean, to carry it, what was a good place to carry it was on the head. Why? Because when you're flying along on your camel, if you don't have something to hold your gutra down, it's going to fly off. So they used it to hold down the gutra, the scarf. Right? Of course, they're driving Mercedes and still wearing it, because this is tradition now, right? It became tradition, no longer serving that purpose, but that's the origin of the, they call it iqal. The iqal, right? Anyway, why did I learn that? I learned it because when I was giving da'wah, me and a group of brothers were giving da'wah to the Americans after the Gulf War. We were involved in a da'wah program. Alhamdulillah, over 3,000 of them accepted Islam from our area. And the Americans used to ask about everything. They wanted to know, what was this? What did this mean? Why do people do this? And that's one of the things they used to ask. Why are they wearing this thing around their head? So I had to go find out because I didn't know. I asked around until finally I got that information. Anyway, the point is, Abu Bakr said, if they paid the value of that cord in the time of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, they're going to pay it now. Omar and the others were saying, hey, the army is gone to the north. We don't have that many people. These people are threatening us. If we don't let them off zakat, they're going to attack Medina. Abu Bakr said, we'll fight them. We don't have. He said, if you're not coming with me, I'll go fight them myself. He is 63 years old. He walks out, he calls for his horse, and he's going. They ran out. Okay, Abu Bakr, inshallah, we're with you. So they prepared to do battle with these people. These people were joined also by those who accepted Islam, jumping on the bandwagon, so to speak, right? Islam was getting strong. They saw, hey, better we join the winning side. So they became Muslims. Now when Prophet ﷺ died, these people who were rejecting zakat, they were a large group. Islam is weak. Jump on the winning side, what appears to them to be the winning side. So they joined up with these who refused to pay zakat. Furthermore, you had some false prophets. You had Musaylama from the tribe of Hanifa in the region of Yamama in Najd. He claimed prophethood. And even from the time of Prophet ﷺ, prior to his death, he had sent a letter to the Prophet ﷺ, saying from Maslama to Prophet of Allah, to Muhammad, Prophet of Allah, let us agree to divide up Arabia between the two of us. Half for you, half for me. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ sent back a letter to Musaylama, which means little Maslama, right? The liar, Al-Kadhab, from Muhammad, messenger of Allah. No way. Okay. So after he died, then this person now had the impetus. People from his tribe joined up with him, and he even claimed he was receiving revelation. And in the south, in Najran, you had another individual from the tribe of Ans, called Al-Aswad Al-Ansi. He also claimed prophethood. And not to be outdone, you also had in the north of Arabia, from the Tamim tribe, you also had Sajah, who claimed prophethood, or she was a prophetess, female. Right? So followers of their tribe, they joined up with them. Eventually Sajah and Musaylama, they joined together, they got married, the prophet and the prophetess, taking on the Muslim state, right? And the Muslims fought. The fighting continued that this is all within the first year, and those wars are called the wars of apostasy, or hurub al-ridda, right? The wars of apostasy. Now, Umar ibn al-Khattab, he noted, because he was involved in the battles, he was out there, he noted that a number of those who had memorized large portions of the Quran, they call them the Qurra, they were dying in the battles. So he went to Abu Bakr and said, we have a problem here. Those who had memorized larger portions are dying. We need to do something. We need to collect this Quran into one text before it gets lost and we end up like the Christians and the others. Now, Abu Bakr, when Omar suggested this to him, his response was, no way. I'm not going to do something which Prophet Muhammad ﷺ didn't do. I'm not prepared to do that. So Omar had to reason with him, sit with him, talk to him, until eventually he was able to win him over, to understand, yes, Allah referred to the Quran as Kitab. ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ. This is the book in which there is no doubt. So Allah referred to the Quran as a book. What was the intent of Prophet ﷺ in having the scribes write this thing down? To preserve it. So putting it into one text was only fulfilling what the Prophet ﷺ had asked them to do. Now, we should also note that large numbers, as we said, of those who were memorized large portions of the Quran were dying in the battles. This is something significant. They were in the front lines of the battles. Why? Because what they memorized of the Quran impacted in their lives in such a way as to make them want to be in the front lines of the battle. They were driven when Allah promises that He has bought from the believers their souls with the payment of paradise. They believed it, and that's why they were in the front lines of the battle. Big difference between that and us today, where we'll have people memorize the whole Quran. They don't even understand what a single word of it says. You know, this has become our tradition now. Memorize the Quran. Why? Because one who memorizes the Quran is able to take 7 of the family members into paradise. So, okay, I'm going to get my son to memorize the Quran, so I'm covered. Right? I can live a enjoyable life as long as my son is hafiz. We're covered. He's going to intercede, carry us all into paradise. Of course, as one of the brothers in England was telling me, who works in the prisons in the north of England, where most of the Indo-Pakistanis who emigrated to England ended up, he said in almost every single prison that he went to in the north of England, there was a hafiz. A hafiz in the prisons. Not as a chaplain treating the prison, no, as a criminal arrested. You know, and he said, you know, it's amazing that the others, the Sikhs and the Hindus, they would be in there for what they call white collar crimes, right? You know, they fraud but the Muslims, they were in there for the big crimes, murder, you know, drugs, rape, you know, all these, the big crimes, that's what they were in there for. And in almost every prison, there was a hafiz. His parents had him go memorize the whole Quran, believing he was going to get everybody to paradise, and then let him loose. You know, and he ended up a criminal like the other people around him. You know. So alhamdulillah, the brother was in there, you know, trying to bring him back. But what is this telling us? It's telling us that memorizing the Quran in this way, this was not the intent. This is not the goal. This was not the way of the Salaf, the way of the early generation of righteous Muslims, the Sahaba and their students. This was not their way. As they relate to us, we didn't used to memorize more than 5 verses or 10 verses of the Quran at a time. And we did not move on to another set until we had understood all of what Allah commanded us in these verses, and we were trying to apply it. We learned knowledge and faith, iman, ilm wa iman at the same time. That's how they learned the Quran. And that's why when they memorized large portions, they ended up in the front lines of the battle. It had an impact. Not like us, as I said today, where we memorize huge portions of the Quran, we don't understand a single word of it. So Abu Bakr, after being convinced, he and Omar decided to go to Zayd ibn Thabit to get him to do the job. And his reaction was the same as Abu Bakr. He refused until he was convinced. And there is significance in this also, that when Abu Bakr this was first suggested to him, he refused because Prophet ﷺ didn't do it. Similarly, Zayd ibn Thabit did the same. This was how concerned they were about not introducing anything in the religion. Very, very concerned. Today, we are very lax. So you will find, for example, in the masjids today, lines on the floor showing you where you should stand. People say it's a good thing. It helps us to straighten our lines, get straight lines. Is it really a good thing? Is it really a good thing? Now, was that need to straighten the lines, did that need exist in the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Yes, it did. Were they able to draw a line in the sand or in the gravel so people could line up? Were they able to do it? Yes. So why didn't the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam do it? If it's a good thing for the prayer, and this is part of the ibadah now, because Prophet ﷺ said, straightening the salah is a part of the salah, part of completing the salah. So this is an act of ibadah. Straightening up these lines is an act of ibadah. So why didn't the Prophet ﷺ do it? Why instead did he turn, check the people in the line, tell them straighten up, straighten your lines, come close together, and tell everybody to look and check? And why? Because this process is a part of training the ummah in following leadership, in cooperating, working together to establish this thing. This is training. So as the scholars of the past said, whenever you bring alive a bid'ah, you kill a sunnah. So now the imams, to straighten the line, they don't need. The lines are already on the floor, everybody gets in lines up. He maybe turned just a glance this way, glance that way, then Allahu Akbar. So that whole sunnah of straightening the lines is lost. And that's why we say that lines in the masjid are bid'ah. The establishment of these lines and the carpets with the lines, this is bid'ah. Not a bid'ah hasana. As the Prophet ﷺ said, every bid'ah is dalala. Every innovation is misguidance. So the companions were very, very careful about not allowing any new things to enter into the practice of the deen. They chose Zayd, why? Because he was one of the best reciters of the Quran. Because he was one of the few who had memorized the whole Quran during the Prophet ﷺ's lifetime. He was with the Prophet ﷺ when he recited the Quran twice in the last Ramadan of his life. And he was also one of the scribes of the Prophet ﷺ who wrote the revelation down. So they chose him, the best qualification, best qualified. And he gathered around himself those who had memorized all or most of the Quran, and those who had written, gathered up all the materials, and he began the process of compiling it on one text, which was out of goat skin. When he finished writing it down, he gave it to Caliph Abu Bakr. And that was all within the first year after the death of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Within 1 year's time of his death, the whole Quran was written down in a single text. When Abu Bakr died, and he died 2 years after that of the death of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he turned it over before his death to Umar ibn al-Khattab. Umar ibn al-Khattab, he kept it with him throughout his reign until he was stabbed in prayer, and prior to his death he turned it over to his daughter Hafsa, who was one of the wives, or former wives of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and she kept it with her in her home. During the early part of the reign of Uthman, people used to come, make copies from it, and compare what they had with what was written there. And midway through the caliphate of Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anhu, one of the companions came to him by the name of Hudhayfa ibn al-Yaman. He came to him and suggested that something needed to be done. There was a problem arising. The problem that a number of the companions, or people from different tribes, Arabian tribes, had begun boasting about their modes of recitation, because the Quran had been revealed in 7 modes. According to the 7 major tribes of Arabia, the Quran was revealed in 7 different ways. And some of these tribes began boasting amongst themselves about whose recitation or mode of recitation was best, and it was starting to create a kind of rivalry. And so Hudhayfa ibn al-Yaman suggested to Uthman ibn al-Affan that something needed to be done. So Uthman, at this point, he called up the companions and decided to make official copies and send them out to the centers of Islam, because by then Islam had spread across Egypt, into Syria, into Iraq. It had gone into parts of India, in Russia, reaching China, up to Turkey. So Islam was spreading quite rapidly at this period. So what he decided to do was he got Zayd ibn Thabit to make 7 official copies and sent one of the copies to all of the various major centers of Islam at the time, along with a qari who would instruct on how the text should be recited. And at that time he also decided, with the agreement of the major companions, to reduce the modes of recitation to the one main mode, which was that of the Quraysh, the main dialect of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Quran then was reduced to that one mode, and with the agreement of the companions, it was agreed that all other copies that people had, their personal copies, etc., would be burnt, and new copies for everybody would be made from the official copies that were sent. This was with the agreement of Muslims in all the major areas. Now, it's important to stop for a minute on that point and address an issue which some of the Orientalists and missionaries tried to raise concerning the Quran's authenticity. And they say, after admitting that by the 3rd century, when Trinitarian Catholic bishops had won the struggle over the Unitarian bishops, right? Unitarians like Arius and others, they were defeated in the Council of Nicaea by vote, and the Trinitarian concept, the three gods in one, became the rule, and they chose now Gospels which somehow implied or had texts which could be used and interpreted to support this concept. They at the same time declared that all other texts were apocryphal and they must be burnt. Anybody caught with these texts would be executed. So they went around the Christian Empire, Holy Roman, so-called Holy Roman Empire, and they burnt all of these other texts. So this process and this practice, in terms of their own history, implies that certain other texts which were out there that were just as authentic historically as the existing texts, these were systematically eliminated. Copies were kept in the Vatican. That was it. They want to compare that and say, okay, just as this happened to us and changes took place, the same thing happened to you Muslims with your Quran. In the time of Uthman radiallahu anhu, they burnt the other texts. There's difference. It's a big difference. In the time of Uthman, that burning took place with the consent. They were not hunting people down and killing anybody who were caught with these other texts, and it was, no. They agreed and personally did their own burnings. Right. They said, hey, we found it. No, your Quran is not that one Quran that you're claiming all along. We found one with variants. Till this day, he has not produced it, what the variants are, so that it could be analyzed. What he claims are variants. Are they variant readings, which is well known? There are different recitations which were known and recorded. Or are they in fact scribes' mistakes? If you find all over the Muslim world one consistent text, and you bring one text from one location where there are variations, what do you do with that? You'll have to say this is error. This individual, if it wasn't variant readings, then there was errors made by this scribe. You don't hold this up now and going to equate it to what exists in the rest of the whole Muslim world, from Tashkent, manuscripts from the first 100 years after the time of Prophet ﷺ, to the Topkapi Museum, to all the other locations where they have ancient manuscripts from the first century, first 2 centuries. You can't do that. So that argument is a red herring, so to speak. So the reality is that the Quran has remained a consistent text, unchanged over the centuries.